And welcome back. Not much new, thankfully, to report on the impeachment front. Nancy Pelosi, she continues to hold up sending the articles of impeachment to the Senate. That is, until she says she's guaranteed of a fair trial. But Mitch McConnell, he's already said he's taking marching orders from the White House, and the Senate Majority Leader doesn't sound like he's in any mood here to hurry the process along.
Seems to me a rather absurd position to say after you've impeached the president, you won't send the papers over to the Senate for the impeachment trial mandated by the Constitution. And we can't go forward until until the Speaker does that. She's apparently trying to tell us how to run the trial. You know, I'm not anxious to have this trial, so if she wants to hold on to the papers, go right ahead.
Apparently, it's really funny, Mitch McConnell. All right, now let's fast forward hypothetically to the end of the trial and Trump remaining president, which is almost a certainty at this point, barring some revelations. What would happen next? What will the fallout be? Will the next president or the president after that ignore subpoenas, totally disregard checks and balances, and call people and groups who oppose him or her traitors? Would he out whistleblowers who are supposed to be protected? What would the new normal be after this president and his actions? Well, my next guest, eminently qualified to answer that and more. He's one of the 17 Watergate prosecutors who penned a piece in the Washington Post saying that Trump ought to be impeached. Nick Akerman joins me now. He's also former assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. And Nick, let me ask you, take you back to Watergate. Was there ever a point where you wondered if the rule of law would have held, that the president would have been compliant to the courts, that subpoenas would have been obeyed, that if evidence was required to be turned over, that it would be? Were you ever worried that he's going to play by the rules?
Absolutely, and that came at the time when Archibald Cox, who was the Watergate special prosecutor, was fired, known as the Saturday Night Massacre. When first Elliot Richardson, who was the Attorney General, wouldn't do it. Bill Ruckelshaus, who was the Deputy Attorney General, wouldn't do it. And finally, they prevailed upon Robert Bork, who was the Solicitor General, to do it. I later learned that, in fact, Richardson, Ruckelshaus, and Bork got together and sort of plotted this out so that Bork would ultimately do it and that the rule of law would remain, and Nixon would not at that point have been able to put a lackey into the Department of Justice to run it. At that point, Nixon was to avoid any way he could turning over those tapes. At one point, he had a Mississippi Democratic senator who was hard of hearing that he offered to have actually listen to the tapes and tell everybody what was on there, which would not be admissible evidence, couldn't be used in a court of law. So, yeah, there were moments there where it was pretty touch and go. I think even going up to the argument over the Supreme Court and where the Supreme Court would go in terms of ordering Nixon to turn over those tapes. And Nixon was ordered to turn over the tapes. And ultimately, that led to the smoking gun tape in which Nixon was overheard directing one of his subordinates to try and get the CIA to contact the FBI to order them to stop investigating the break-in to the Watergate. And it was at that point that there were Republicans who, had enough moral courage to go to Nixon and tell him it's time to step down.
You know, Nick, I'm glad you mentioned the Saturday Night Massacre and put that into today's window, because at this point you can know what to expect of the president. I don't think he's a very complex figure to understand the id of where he's going to go in every circumstance, but we didn't have a situation where when you have Barr, for all intents and purposes, is acting as a personal attorney for the president. For Christ's sakes, he's going after his own Justice Department and their own integrity. That's what, to me, it's the abettors of the act that are saying there's nothing to see here, versus what the idea of the Founding Fathers was. You got the legislative branch is supposed to be the check and balance, right? And the courts certainly are not subverted to the president as well. It's almost like that all went out the window, and nobody knows, the role they're supposed to play, or chooses not to at least adhere to it.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And you've got someone like Barr, who, has really been the president's lawyer and defender all along. He came out with that 3-page summary that was totally false on the Mueller investigation. When the whistleblower report came to his attention, he basically gave an opinion that it didn't have to be turned over to Congress, even though the law directed that it be turned over to Congress. He also refused to open a criminal investigation into the matter. And on top of it all, that famous July 25th tape, there are multiple references to Barr assisting in that whole effort to get the Ukrainian government to announce investigations into the Bidens. And on top of it all, Attorney General Barr has also opened an investigation into the origins of the Russian investigation, even though 18 intelligence agencies had concluded that, in fact, it was Russia that broke into the Democratic National Committee and interfered with our election.
I'm curious, Nick. We mentioned before off the top that you and 16 other prosecutors in Watergate all took the position with the evidence already in front of us. There's been impeachable offenses by the president, even worse than what you dealt with at Watergate. When you get around and say, okay, on the other end of this, if this comes out the way we think, that you're not going to have 20 Republicans and every single Democrat in the Senate impeach the president on either of the two articles, what's the fallout? Do presidents now not have to respond, to, basically directives that they got to turn over evidence or have witnesses testify? Do people, literally, sitting members of Congress, get to out whistleblowers without consequence? The president literally calls people traitors and talks about the death penalty because they follow the proper protocols within the intelligence community in terms of being a whistleblower. And I can go on. But my point is this, where do we come out on the other side of this with the rule of law?
The bottom line coming out of all of this is, if the Senate's not going to stand up and be a fair and impartial jury and consider the facts, unlike the House, who didn't even bother, the Republicans there didn't even bother to address those facts. If they do not, what we're left with is a jury of the electorate that is going to have to decide whether this is what we want, and this is the kind of democracy we want. And it's going to be up to the electorate to make the ultimate decision here as a jury, not the Senate.
What happens if, and I think this will happen, let's say the end of January, February, they vote and the president's not convicted in the Senate. But between then and the election, Bolton's book comes out. All of a sudden, your old stomping grounds, the SDNY, might come out with some of the cases we believe were referred to by Mueller. The financial returns of the president comes out that shows inherent conflicts of interest, or certainly major question marks about questionable monies. Do they impeach again? Where do we go from here? Or is that simply up to the electorate to make up their mind come next November?
I think that the one real somewhat known unknown here are the tax returns. I mean, there is no legitimate reason why the president of the United States would not show his tax returns to the American people unless he's a tax cheat. And I think that's what we're going to find out. So the question is, how bad is it? Is it bad enough that Congress feels they have to re-impeach him yet again? Or are we going to be so close to the election that it's really going to be in the hands of the electorate to decide what to do with this president?
Amazing times we live in. Nick Akerman, thank you as always for your time tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, when we come back, the president, he wants to get rid of Obamacare, and he could get his wish, but I think you ought to be careful what he wishes for, because that would hurt a whole lot of millions of Americans, and a lot of them in MAGA country.